We are going to have Dr. William Dalrymple speaking now I can't pronounce this, so there's a good chance to embarrass myself, from Berenike to Ajanta, the Romano-Egyptian connection to early Buddhist art of South and Central Asia. And we're very excited about this talk and very privileged to have with us as chair Dr. Alok Tripathi, who I'll just introduce in 2 lines. He is currently Assistant Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India and is Professor of History at Silchar University in Assam. He's the first underwater archaeologist in India and has led many expeditions and discoveries, conducted extensive studies on ancient trade routes, studied shipbuilding technology, and he's authored and edited over 17 books, including Studies of Northeast India, the collected works of Subhasi Malik, Maritime Heritage of the Indian Ocean, Expressions in Indian Art, Essays in Memory of M.C. Joshi with B.R. Mani, and on India and the Eastern Seas. So I don't think there could be a better person. He has research papers on rock art, museums, amphorae, and Chinese porcelain, among other subjects.
Most of his books are award-winning, and some of the very famous are The Age of Kali, White Mughals, Last Mughals, 9 Lives in Search of Secret in Modern India, Return of a King, The Writer's Eye. He is very actively engaged in editorship of a number of publications, presently working on his e-book. And
new book is called The Golden Road. Coming out in October.
Yeah. And in the morning, we were wondering about the early phase of maritime activities, periplus. And here he is going to take us to the very recent findings in excavations which are being conducted on the Red Sea port, Berenike. From there to Begram, the famous findings of 50 to 125 CE, the hoard and the beautiful collection. And from there he takes us to the early paintings of Ajanta, Cave 10. And then he tried to trace that how these maritime connections were affecting the art traditions. And he poses some very genuine questions from where we get the real information. And earlier we have seen that means in the historical sources we have a lot of information in the written form. But he is venturing in an area where the written records are very few, and based on the material evidence, their interpretation, based on the antiquities, he is going to try to visualize the actions and ultimately to reach the actors of those paintings. So I invite William to make his presentation.
Well, first of all, pity anyone who has to follow the great Sanjay Subramaniam, but fortified by 3 IIC samosas, I feel I have no option but to take on the task. And in my favor, I am mentioning the periplus, which someone wanted to hear about. I'm sure everyone here is aware of these extraordinary new discoveries at the Red Sea port of Berenike, discovered 2 years ago by Steve Sidebottom's Chicago team. They show an extraordinary face of the Buddha in a sculpture mined from marble in what is now Turkey, showing strong influence of Gandhara in what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, but probably made in Alexandria, in what is now Egypt, for a sailor who was probably from India. It's a cliche that Gandharan art is cosmopolitan, another word that was missing, according to one questioner. But this piece is so multinational and so multi-religious in its connections that it's a perfect symbol for what we now know about the astonishing internationalism and sophistication of the trade and the interconnections passing up and down the Indian Ocean with the winds of every monsoon. This Buddha here has solar rays coming out as if he's a sun deity like Sol or Mithras, of which there are many on the Levantine coast. And his hair is what Marianne Bergman nicely described as tortellini curls, which I think perfectly captures it, but made with a drill, which is never used in Gandhara. So very definitely probably made in Alexandria, Egypt. And this is part of an increasing body of finds that are turning up at Berenike from an Indian trading milieu, Tamil Brahmi pottery graffiti, has one naming a Tamil visitor calling himself the chieftain Koran, Prakrit and Sanskrit inscriptions found at the site, recording the visits of several other Indians, deposits inevitably of dal, rice, coconuts, coriander, tamarind, and then a whole series of huge 10 kilogram pots containing several thousand black peppercorns from India, perhaps indicating that the merchants preferred their own cuisine to the foul mesdames or whatever was on option in the Red Sea coast in the 1st century. And these discoveries in Berenike are part of a remarkable renaissance in studies of the Indian Ocean world and its connections, which over the last 2 decades has illuminated the scale, the surprising scale, of the contact between Roman Egypt and India. As you all know, thanks to the monsoon winds, it's in fact very easy to travel between the Red Sea coast of Egypt and the mouth of the Indus, the Gujarat ports, and Kerala, Maziris, Bruch, and so on. Indian traders heading west used to arrive with the trade winds in the early summer and ride the summer monsoon home in August. With the winds behind you, the journey from the mouth of the Red Sea, where the Houthis are currently in operation, to Gujarat could take as little as 40 days. Though if you missed the winds, the round trip might have taken as long as a year and forced you to spend a prolonged holiday on the Nile. The equivalent overland trade routes by camel caravan through Afghanistan would take at least 3 times as long. And since the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, we all know from our Shakespeare, Antony and Cleopatra committing suicide, and Egypt absorbed into the Roman Empire. And this gives Rome a sea border with India and the Indian Ocean trade, but not only between these 2 points, Egypt and India, but on the way, of course, also Ethiopia and Aksum. This is from some of the newly exhibited sculptures from Amaravati, and seem to show Aksumite or Ethiopian envoys, maybe at the Satavahana court in this story, in this Jataka story, and these guys in very courtly short tunics with cornrow hair, standing very tall, being introduced to the king, probably reflects a whole world of which we have only very small hints. There have been scholars working at this from many different directions, not just historians and archaeologists, but those working on the ancient economy, classicists studying Roman plays and novels, as well as numismatists, historians of science, Buddhist scholars, and Sanskritists. And what you're seeing is this desire to get, by the Romans, to get their hands on the luxuries and the wealth of India. Ever since Alexander had opened up the road, the Greeks had fantasized about this place where gold was dug by gigantic ants and guarded by griffins, as Herodotus put it. And since the Battle of Actium opens up this highway, this maritime highway, the people of the Roman Empire begin to become eager consumers of Indian goods and luxuries. particularly the spices of southern India and cotton from Gujarat. It is the Ptolemaic rulers before Rome who build the two great Red Sea ports, Myos Hormos and Berenike, but it's after Actium in 30 BC that the scale begins to change, and we see massively increased interaction between the two. According to the Greek Alexandrian geographer Strabo, Roman control of Egypt led to a 5-fold increase of shipping heading to India compared to the Ptolemaic period that preceded it. Formerly, he says, not even 20 vessels ventured to navigate the Persian Gulf, but now large fleets are dispatched. He notes in a much quoted passage that 120 boats left for India every year from the port of Myos Hormos alone. Pliny, a little bit later, writing just before the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, is upset by this trade. He's a puritanical naval commander, and he disapproves of people putting pepper in their food, and even more so of Roman matrons wearing silks. He says, India is the sink of the world's most precious metals. There is no year in which does not drain our empire of at least 55 million sesterces. So great is the labor employed, and so distant is the region drawn upon to enable our Roman matrons to flaunt see-through clothes in public. Thus, he says, is India brought near by greed and by women's decadent need to follow the fashion. Poor old Pliny ends up dying in the eruption of Vesuvius shortly afterwards, and so no longer had to look at see-through silken garments for much longer. The traffic also brings Roman embassies, and you can see some of them on Trajan's column, arriving to discuss maybe balance of payment problems. There are references in novels from the period and plays to Indians among the audiences of shows and games in Alexandria, and one classical author, Xenophon of Ephesus, writes about an Indian Raja who'd come to the great Mediterranean port to sightsee and train, and who seemingly possessed a home in the port. Alexandria was, after all, the hub where goods from India and the Red Sea were received and were exported across the Mediterranean to Rome and beyond. Now, the principal source for so much of the figures that have been spun to try and illuminate the scale of this trade comes from this one document, whose origins are obscure, maybe from the site of Oxyrhynchus, where so many papyri have been discovered, now in Vienna. And the document, there's much argument and discussion about it, and the figures are all in a state of academic flux, but it seems to be drawn up by an Alexandrian-based Ramano-Egyptian financier for the purchase of goods from an Indian merchant in faraway Maziris on the coast of Kerala. It's a fragmentary loan contract and shipping manifest that follows the standard template used by Alexandrian shippers for such orders, and which gives a detailed assessment of the fiscal value of the cargo being imported. In particular, it gives details about one cargo sent to Berenike all the way from Maziris aboard a particular ship called the Hamapollon. But what caught the attention of historians is the jaw-dropping value of the goods in question. The exports include tons of ivory, 4 tons, maybe the sort of thing that ended up being made into the famous Yakshi from Pompeii, which was buried along with Pliny in the eruption at Vesuvius. The ivory alone is given the value of 7 million sestertii, at a time when a Roman soldier would have earned about 800 sestertii annually, and a would-be senator from the cream of the Roman aristocracy had to demonstrate assets of 1 million sestertii to be allowed to stand for office. The consignment also included a valuable shipment of 800 boxes of aromatic nard used in the manufacture of perfume, a consignment of tortoiseshell, and 790 pounds of Indian textiles, probably cotton, then considered a luxury product, more valuable than silk. The total value of the 150-ton shipment has been calculated as worth 131 talents, which, according to one historian who studied it, is, quote, enough to purchase 2,400 acres of the best farmland in Egypt or a premium estate in central Italy. A single trading ship, such as the Hamapollon, could apparently carry several such consignments, each worth a small fortune. No wonder then that Pliny mentions cohorts of archers, which were carried on board such ships sailing to India to offer protection against the Houthis of their days, the pirates in the Red Sea. One successful shipment of this value could turn the merchant behind it into some of the richest men in the empire. And that was not all. According to the papyrus, the import tax paid on the cargo of almost 9 million sestertii was worth 2 million sestertii. Working up from these figures, the economic historian Raoul McCaughlin has estimated that by the 1st century BC, Indian exports into Egypt were probably worth over 1 billion sestertii per annum, of which the tax authorities of the Roman Empire creamed off no less than 270 million. Some scholars, such as Matthew Cobb, who's now becoming the great historian of this period and who's written innumerable books on the Red Sea trade, have queried some aspects of McCaughlin's calculations, but there is a consensus that the scale of the trade and the customs take is hugely larger than was previously thought. Revenues on this scale surpassed those of entire regions. McCaughlin notes that Julius Caesar imposed a tribute of 40 million sestertii after his conquests of Gaul, while the vital Rhineland frontier, defended by 8 legions, cost Rome an annual figure of 88 million sestertii. If the figures in the Masiris Papyrus are correct, and there's no reason to doubt them, the custom taxes raised on the trade coming through the Red Sea would alone have covered around 1/3 of the entire Roman imperial budget. Enough to administer the legions from the lowlands of Scotland to the borders of Persia and from the Sahara to the Rhine and the Danube. These calculations have been much debated, but they certainly made it into the introduction of the latest edition of the Oxford Guide to the Roman Economy. The implications of this unprecedented scale of direct trade between India and Egypt are enormous. The sea trade between Rome and India was clearly an immense operation, dangerous and complex, but highly profitable. Contrary to popular notions about overland Silk Roads, and this is the always rather slightly irritating map that you see in books, which completely bypasses India. It's shown to be this sort of apparently eternal road that stretches from the China Sea to the coast of the Mediterranean. According to this idea, India is left out of this. But if you actually look at finds of Roman coins, you get a very different picture. It seems now more and more clear that it was India, not China, that was the greatest trading partner of the Roman Empire. It's also clear that the main arteries of early east-west travel lay less overland through a Persia often at war with Rome, and much more across the open oceans via the choppy waters of the Indian Ocean, and then punted often up the Indus and its tributaries. This is why only a handful of Roman coins have ever turned up in China, just a few scattered finds and one single hoard of uncertain date containing 16 coins representing different emperors from Tiberius to Aurelian. On the other hand, Roman coins are found today by archaeologists in India in their thousands, and have been ever since the 18th century, when the East India Company factors in Madras first reported discovering what they called 5 coolie loads of Roman gold coins, as well as some thousands, they reported, of silver coins. And to this day, Kerala and Tamil Nadu particularly, hoards turn up still with the trowels of the archaeologist. So if the scale of this contact between Roman Egypt and India was so much larger than previously recognized, what are the implications for art history? Scholars have talked for over a century about Hellenistic, Greek, and Roman influence on the art of South Asia, particularly visible on the sculptures of Gandhara. But maybe we should be more precise than that. if all the shipping and most of the trade reached India and the Mediterranean was coming from the Red Sea ports of Egypt, what are the signs of specifically Ptolemaic, Ramano-Egyptian, and Byzantine Coptic influence on Indian art and culture? This raises further questions. How far should we regard Egypt at the time as simply a subservient part of Rome, and how far should we look at it as a semi-independent agent with its own pre-existing and long-standing connections to India, Bactria, Gandhara, and Asia? Certainly we know that there were Egyptians working this route. Certainly we know that there were Italians from the far side of the Mediterranean working this route. Hang on, we've lost the slide in question. The Petici family of the Abruzzi were the kind of Chianti Rome exporters of their day. And their wine has been found as far away as Carthage, but one of the Petici's agents seems to have left his graffiti in a rock shelter halfway between Berenike and the Nile, as you can see in the top of the left-hand slide. And in their hometown in the Abruzzi, north of Rome, we have this fabulous gravestone of a dromedary carrying wine, and apparently across the desert. So presumably this is how the wine that the Petici sent to Alexandria down the Nile made it to the Red Sea. And there are frequent references to one of the few exports that Indians were interested in buying, other than just getting Roman gold, being wine. And there seems to be a very thirsty appetite from an early date. And the Periplus, to bring the Periplus into it, particularly mentions the considerable appetite. Plus, there's another Oxyrhynchus papyrus has a version of a play by Euripides, a kind of transposed Iphigenia in Taurus, where the action is moved to India, and where the heroine escapes, having got the Indians drunk, and they all start slurring in the speech. So there seems to be a running joke that rather like sort of whiskey drinkers in Daman and Diu on the edge of Gujarat, that there was a considerable appetite for Roman wine in early India. Yes, what should we be looking for here? Again, old cliches about Apollo being the origin of some of the Gandhara Buddhist images, but increasingly art historians are pointing not to classical Greek or Macedonian or Bactrian models for the Gandharan sculptures, but specifically Roman. And this slide, I think, shows very well that in the drapery how similar a Gandharan matria can be to a statue of Augustus. And then we have, of course, the famous Peshawar Trojan horse on its little wheels on the right. Peter Stewart has written a fascinating paper trying to distinguish Greek and Roman influence, which is very difficult to do. But he's found specific compositions based on Roman friezes, and especially sarcophagus lids dated from the period of Augustus, which seem to show that what we're dealing with, the kind of influence that we're dealing with in Gandhara, is not classical Greek, going back, as the Raj art historians like to imagine, to Alexander the Great, but instead to exactly what's being produced at the same time in Rome and in Egypt. But how can we find specifically, what should we look for when looking for specifically Egyptian influence? And here Naman Ahuja has written two fascinating essays, one in Marg, a special issue of Marg a couple of years ago, when he starts looking for specifically Romano-Egyptian gods. Now, the first sign of Roman influence is in the famous libation trays. At the top two, you've got two from Taxila. On the bottom, we have one from Alexandria with Horus. Now, these may well be a specifically Egyptian influence on the very beginnings of Gandharan art. But it's when you start looking for specifically Ptolemaic Egyptian deities, as Naman did in his fascinating paper, that we begin to see the influence of objects specifically from Egypt rather than the wider Roman Empire. And in most cases, the gods are not the great gods of pharaonic Egypt so much as syncretic Ptolemaic deities that make their presence felt later in the Roman, late Greek and Roman period, especially Serapis and Harpocrates and Isis. And again, in Bagram, in the famous hoard found in what is either a royal treasury or a merchant's storeroom, depending on your taste, we find again specifically Egyptian images. Here is an image of the Pharaoh's lighthouse in Alexandria. Here we have Egyptian glass with images of the harvest made in Alexandria. A gladiator on the right, an image of the harvest on the left. We have specifically Egyptian porphyry turning up from Mons Porphyrius, the great source of all porphyry, which was an imperial monopoly. These are Numan's images and his work that I'm quoting here. And then you have specifically these three gods, Serapis, Isis, Harpocrates. Harpocrates, shown with his finger touching his mouth, sometimes two fingers, turns up left. There's a small image in Taxila. Center, right is one of Hariti's children from Gandhara, now in the British Museum image of Hariti. These very small children from different cosmologies line the side of that image. Near here, in the Matra Museum, you have an image interpreted as Rishishringa with two figures on his mouth, which seems to echo this Harpocrates from Antinoe in Upper Egypt. Here again are various takes on this. And look at Isis and Hariti. In the center slide, you have an image from Antinoe in Upper Egypt from the 1st century of a nursing Isis. And here, to left and right, very similar Gandharan images that are extraordinarily alike, including the drapery, the baby, the hand raised. Ditto Serapis. On the left, we have a Serapis found in Bagram. On the center, contrary to what the caption says, the center is an Alexandrian, is a Gandharan Serapis, and here is Serapis from the main center of his cult in Alexandria. Serapis also appears on Kushan coins. So this is a specific set of Egyptian deities that were not worshipped widely elsewhere, except among Egyptian expatriates, which are now turning up on coins made by the imperial Kushans in the late 2nd century AD CE. Also, in this famous Met plaque, which Navina walks past every day on her way to lunch, there is the famous image of Osho's Shiva on the left, but also Serapis, or possibly Zeus, on the right. But what I'd like to focus on, and which I'm very interested in, are these images from Miran, which is a Gandharan site, but over the other side of the Himalayas, in the Tarim Basin, near Yarkand and between Yarkand and Kashgar. There's a long art historical bibliography about these wonderful images dug up by Aurel Stein in the 20s, sitting for long undisplayed, but now the best ones are up in the National Museum. And art historians have talked about some of the gestures being Persianate. There is some iconography of various Jataka narratives that go back to Bahut and show a bit of Indian influence. But as Aurel Stein recognized, there is very heavy Coptic influence. And it is the Coptic art that I'd like to focus on now. Not only does it look very Coptic, there is a signature of an artist called Tita, which may well be a version of Titus. So you might have an expatriate Romano-Egyptian artist traveling through Gandhara and making it all the way to very near to Kashgar. They're wonderful things, but look particularly at the way that the lips and the eyes are drawn with those dark strokes with the red underpinning. And in this wonderful Cupid that again looks very classical. Now you find similar iconography also in Gandharan sculpture. Compare the figure of the Buddha to this Gandharan sculpture with a very similar hairdo and moustache, now in the British Museum. But compare it also to Coptic textiles. These are Coptic textiles which have actually turned up also in the Tarim Basin, and look particularly at the lips, how the red of the lips is done with the black line breaking it. And again, this is very similar to what you find done more finely, but in the same similar sort of style in the Al Fayum portraits. Look again at the lips here, at the eyes, and look at the curls in the hair fashions, in the coiffure. This particular Coptic hanging is now in Austria. But this is the one that I love best of all. In the center, you have a bodhisattva from Miran. Left and right of him, you have images of Coptic saints from the monastery of St. Jeremiah, Saqqara. And look at this strange way of doing the chin, which I've never seen anywhere else, this circle for a chin. And there it is at Miran, exactly the same, with the same red and black eyes. It's very, very close. Here again, compare our National Museum Miran Buddha on the right to the Saqqara Jeremiah on the left. Very, very close parallels. And then here is the National Museum gorgeous Buddha with his disciples on the top, and here's a fragment of a Coptic papyrus of Jesus and his disciples underneath. It's the same composition. It's very close. Ditto. This again is the National Museum. Look at this compared to the mummy portrait, because remember, so many of these Gandharan sculptures would originally have been painted. We always imagine them as that dark schist, but that was not how they originally were. They were painted, and I suspect the paint, as is shown in this very rare example of a painted, I don't know whether it's stone or whether it's terracotta, but anyway, you can see the colouring is not dissimilar to the Fayum portraits. So there are various other items that have turned up in the Tarim Basin, not far from Iran, which are the textiles, Kushan textiles, very rare. There's this famous trouser leg on the left, with this figure with a spear coming off the top of his shoulder, with a very classical centaur on the left. And then you've got these two other, probably Kushan textiles, which are now in St. Petersburg and were found in a Hun grave, a Zhongnu grave. But again, look at these three-quarter profiles, these mustachioed faces, this slight air of melancholy. And we're now going to go to Ajanta, but not to the famous, familiar Cave 1, 6th century images, but to the much less well-known but fascinating Cave 10 images, which were recently beautifully restored by Ashok's colleague, Manager Singh. But then in the way of the ASI, not publicized at all. This amazing achievement was made and beautifully conserved, and then it never, and I literally just walked into Cave 10 4 years ago, saw these, realized I'd never seen them in any publication. And they are a completely different style, but very close to those Kushan textiles. The cave, we know, was dug around 150, 100 BCE. These, judging by the Kushan textiles, might be 100 years later, 150 years later. Same three-quarter profiles, same slightly melancholic attitudes in their faces. Am I imagining that air of melancholy? It just seems to be something as is part of a shared world in some way. Let's put the two together. Here is the Kushan textile in St. Petersburg. There is the Cave 10 figure of a guard. This seems to be part of a wider aesthetic and visual style which plays out over a vast Hellenized region at this point, visible all the way from Palmyra through Parthia, but which, judging by these Cave 10 images, may have extended to Satavahana territory at this period. And the reason we've never seen them is that early British restorers helpfully covered them with varnish, which then got instantly clouded with batshit, and so have never been in any book of Gandharan, never been photographed in any book of Ajanta paintings. And they are extraordinary, very early, and probably the oldest Buddhist paintings in existence. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know any older.